have the pleasure to welcome Ingrid Mayrhofer-Hufnagl tonight. She's a trained architect with a Ph.D. from the University of Innsbruck, and she works between science, art, and architecture, and and having a look on how we can integrate processes into the architecture and life of buildings and processes and contexts. So therefore, please.
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation. I'm super excited to be here today and talk to you. So, most of the work I'm showing you today is work in progress, even though it might be work that is in progress since a couple of years. But before I'm going into that, I'm telling you a bit who we are, what we do, and why we do what we do. So our lab or practice, sometimes we call it a workshop, is driven by the vision of designing processes and complex systems that realign the built and the natural environment rather than designing buildings or an urban master plan, for instance. So it's about designing ecologies instead of objects, protocols of interplay that have long temporal dimensions. And we do that by collaborating with various kinds of intelligence, so human and non-human alike. And this also explains the naming of our think tank, Architectural Minds. So we do consider it as a composition or as an assembly of various minds or different forms of creativity to take on the challenge to rethink and reconceptualize the way we live together. So it is about looking at the world through different eyes, but informed by a lot of what we do know and trying to think of new kinds of structures and processes that we could generate together with everybody else that we share this planet with. And in the hope of a kind of a more just and equitable future. So we believe that this becomes even more important and relevant, considering that for the first time in our planet's record, the anthropomass, so everything that the human being has produced and constructed, outweighed Earth's entire biomass by 2020. And this might triple in less than 20 years. So because human population continues to grow, at least by 2.5 billions by 2050, as the United Nations prognoses, and therefore consuming more and more resources and altering the very environment we rely on, what has taken nature billions of years of evolution to create. So beyond repairing what we have already damaged, we think about can we positively contribute to the advancement of nature? Can we not only maintain nature, but augment it while constructing the necessary infrastructure for the additional planet inhabitants? So the first project, which is called Othering, I'm showing places significant emphasis on the lessons of the natural world and what it is teaching us about intelligence. So it questions how we can leverage that information to alter our built environment towards something more harmonious and in synergy with the planet. So the central idea behind this is to utilize nature as a means of re-evaluating our approach to constructing artificial environments, so a built environment, by combining natural intelligence with the technological advances of AI. So we aim to reconfigure urban structures and generate new architectural plans and spatial organizations that are more in tune with nature-centric values. So the project isn't focused on biomimicry, or should not be misunderstood in that direction, but it does draw inspiration from nature's creatures that excel in areas we struggle with. And a really good example of this is a slime mold, like you see in that project, which are strange unicellular little critters, somewhere between a fungi and an algae. they don't really fit into the established categories we have for other species. So slime molds spend part of their life cycle as a kind of individual little squiggly amoeba-like creatures, and sometimes just kind of a big sack of cytoplasm with free-floating nuclei as a kind of collaborative and cooperative agents. And they have some particular extraordinary abilities. So a few years ago, and I don't know, maybe you know that experiment, some researchers at the University of Tokyo made a sort of petri dish arrangement with oat flakes, which the slime mold really like to eat, and in the pattern of a population center of the greater Tokyo area. And they also used light, which slime mold don't like very much, to represent kind of rivers, mountains, or any other geographical obstacles. And then they put the slime mold on the plate. And what slime mold tries to do, or at least seems to do, is find the most efficient routes between food sources. And within 24 hours, the slime mold had basically recreated very clearly and obviously the pattern of the Tokyo metro system. And this is a very cleverly engineered, highly efficient network system for this kind of particular geographical outline. And that's a neat trick, but it goes quite a lot further. So scientists subsequently discovered that they could set up an experiment to see how well slime mold could solve the famous traveling salesman problem, which is a very simple mathematical problem that's very, very hard to solve. So it simply asked the question that if you have 5 or 6 cities to visit, what's the shortest route you can take to visit each of them, but only once? And this is incredibly hard for humans and for computers because it's what's called exponentially difficult. Because if you have 5 cities, it's 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1 possible route, and you have to evaluate each one. And there is no shortcut. But if you add more cities, then it's 6 times, and so forth and so forth. So it gets much, much harder very, very quickly, which is exactly the kind of problems that humans and sometimes even computers absolutely hate. But slime molds don't seem to have a problem with it. So they solve it in a linear way, in a linear time. It doesn't get harder for them each time. And they just keep solving it on the same kind of a straight line of a straight line of time solving. And we don't know how they do it exactly. So it's not a mechanism that we are amenable to, and yet they have solved the problem that we spent, humanity actually collectively, spent billions of euros on. And we find somehow a way to handle it, but we never find a mechanism that is so efficiently like the one of a slime mold. So there are obviously some ability and also some other way of thinking. And we were interested in this other way of thinking and seeing it, and asked what kind of habitations and spatial organization would nature create for us. So the project named Invisible City centered on the idea of an anthropocentric collective intelligence, which encompasses the collective knowledge and expertise of different cultural backgrounds and geographical areas of cities over a long period of time. So the form of intelligence can also be described as urban intelligence, as it is embedded within the physical structure of the city. So the idea draws on the theory of an Italian architect, Aldo Rossi, who wrote about the city and its collective memory in the 1960s. Rossi believed that the city is a product of collective memory, a repository of shared experience and cultural heritage of different epochs that is deposited in the immovable substance of the city. He argued that the city is not simply a physical space, but a cultural artifact that embodies the history, traditions, and values of the community, that inhibits it and has inhibited it in the past. So Rossi believed that architecture and urban design should reflect and reinforce this collective memory. So again, he believed that the collective memory is materialized in the architecture of the city. And counter to that, we think that today the collective memory of a city is becoming increasingly diverse and rapidly changing than the built architecture is able to reflect it. So the project Invisible City draws on this gap and makes visible the invisible collective memory in the urban structure. So what kind of unseen city does the current collective memory create? That was the question that has driven that work. So we collected a lot of data from all kinds of city and processed it with an AI to see what kind of cities are in the existing. So the project is an exploration of the recombination of known urban elements or different typologies of various cities into novel ones. So the generated structures reassembled the cities into an imagined architecture of the city by the collective, intending to create a more balanced representation of the citizen of a certain urban area within the digital space. So, and what fascinates us is that computer vision and deep learning can offer a bridge between the physical city, its architecture, and the immaterial collective memory that can only be accessed through high levels of computation. So we did a lot of research on the results we received, analyzed it with traditional urban design tools, and realized that they are actually not applicable. We think that this is due to the fact that in satellite images there are more information stored in one pixel than our binary tools or a plan drawing is able to encode. Plan drawings usually just focusing on one level of information, but in satellite images you have many more attributes stored, like you have information on the materiality, on the height of a building, on the topography, and this is all processed at once and therefore hybridized in a very different way. So we got results that were quite surprising for us, but without going into further details here, we just published a paper on that a couple of weeks ago. It's open access, so everyone can look into it if you're interested. That research on the city, which draw on a planetary scale, is currently progressing into a commissioned work by the Resilience Festival in Bologna. It's called We Don't Live Where We Are. And it's about the idea, if you ask people where they live, they would indicate their home's location on a map. But yet, if you ask about the source of their wealth, they would need to produce a completely different map depicting the landscapes that sustains them. And this second map is an interwoven representation that surpasses the limits of a standard topographical map, expanding across both space and time. So what we do is we try to get behind the scenes of the modern city. We explored the resource landscapes that produce the city, and in turn the waste landscapes that the city produces. So, and we did that also the last term with our students. They're always part of our research. And these are some examples on cities and their landscapes. And with this project, we are trying to make this argument in order to understand a city today, you need to look at all those multiple landscapes scattered around the globe and that are implicated in the production of a city. So it's actually quite hard to define where a city starts and where it ends, as it is distributed over the planet. And these are some first experiments with it, with the AI, to make those or to condense the spatial and temporal distribution of all those different landscapes and to make visible the kind of chimerical and odd urban landscapes that what we're actually producing. So those experiments are then, we're currently working on them and translating them into 3D physical objects with multi-material 3D printing. And the last project I want to introduce you as one of our core research topics. It's on 3D generative adversarial networks. So as, of course, architects are interested or particularly interested in the third dimension. And therefore, we wanted to apply or find a way how to apply AI and generative adversarial networks into 3D geometries. And 3D GANs are developing very slowly and are still a very problematic issue because of the increased complexity of higher dimension data that exponentially extends computing time, and the inconsistency of cohesive 3D data representation, and also the missing or limited access to 3D data that is necessary for all deep learning approaches. So due to the gap, we developed a workflow that enables us to process 3D data of all various representational formats. So it doesn't matter if it's NURBS, meshes, point clouds, voxels, to hybridize and synthesize architectural structures across different scales and topologies. And therefore, we harvested hundreds of buildings manually over several years. And the main criteria was that they contain all the interior information. So that means walls, ceilings, staircases, corridors, windows, doors, etc. Because we were interested in new spatial arrangements. Other 3D GAN research goes more or is more focused on the building massing or the envelope of a building. So also that one is going to be published these days in a scientific paper. But what I wanted to show you is more that we implemented that research in the project called The Aesthetic of the Crowd. Thereby we examined the anthropometry in architecture, which has a significant impact on the design of buildings since antiquity. So in particular, an averaged ideal white male body. So in one, or probably the most famous example is the drawing from the Renaissance artist and scientist Leonardo da Vinci, which you all know, who was inspired by the description of man's ideal human body of the ancient architect Vitruvius. That's why that image is called the Vitruvian Man. Another example is by the architect Le Corbusier in the 1955. He designed a model known as the modular, which further established humans' ideal ratios that should be considered in the creative architectural process. So, and the most famous example is Ernst and Peter Neufert's Bauentwurfslehre, in English Architect's Data, which is published in 1936 and translated into 18 languages. And that guidebook, so to say, remains unquestioned the standard till today in the building industry, but especially for architects. So, and even that we know that a human body varies according to age, gender, and ethnicity. I think in the meantime, we have reached the 42nd edition of that book. There have been slightly adaptation, but it always remained rooted in its origin. So based on that and inspired by Louis Bourge's imaginary being, we created these hybrid beings, partly human, partly non-human, partly more than human. and trying to establish a new proportional system of architecture that decentralizes the human and emphasize that the human being is just one part of a bigger ecosystem. So, and in particular, it is a provocation that questions if male standards and their anthropometrics are an adequate measure on which to base all standards in science, technology, and engineering. And that is not only the case in the building industry, but also in medicine, as just as another example. So what we developed is a process that reconfigures and adapts existing architectural structures to those new proportional systems out of these imaginary beings. And these results went into a new data set, which was then fed into the GAN process that we developed. And the idea was to get new imaginaries how a multi-species habitat could look like. So what could it be, or what could be the future of an urban biodiversity be? So those are basically showing the different models, how the real-time application was set up. The intention is that new data can constantly be added to the data set and thereby contribute to a participatory design process, but also to creating a 3D data set by a collective. So the consequence of this new proportional system is that we received results of higher diversity of room heights and spatial dimensions. And that provokes our imagination. Let us wonder who is living in these spaces, how different species are coexisting and sharing the three-dimensional structures and those spaces. So I hope I was able to give you some insights into our work, which is driven by the belief that we need to shift our perspective and recognize that the human being is not inherently superior to other ways of existing in the world, and that we also need to consider that in architecture, which we always considered as human-centered. And by doing so, we can learn a great deal about living sustainable with the planet and its diverse species, and in particular, the resources from which we draw. This means treating others with more care and respect than we have in the past, and reimagining our relationships, decision-making processes, and how we share space and resources, and an overall mindset towards the environment and other species. So rather than seeing them as inferior, we should view them as valuable collaborators with unique and impressive capabilities that we can learn from. And ultimately, and with this, I'm leaving you, we believe that we need a fundamental reconsider how we want to live together and construct our habitation and coexist with others on this planet. Thank you.
So let's start with questions. Marius, would you like to start, or should I start?
Well, I can start. Thank you very much. It was really interesting. My first question is, since you were saying you were experimenting with different maybe shapes or materials, are you saying that if white male architects are planning houses, they look like white male humans are living in them? Or are you saying architects plan for families? So why would the type of architect influence the shape of a house if it's not if he's not planning for himself as a man?
I'm not sure if I get that question right, but let me try to answer, and you tell me. So what I want to question is that that everything that we how big a door is, how big a window is, how high our chairs and tables are measured on an averaged male body. So, and I would like to question that, because why are stairs? Is it the right measurements for whom? You know, if kids go up and down, so why? Yeah.
Yeah. So exactly, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
So, but now, if you use this tool AI, are you then kind of suggesting that the AI will build on regulations that fits AI? So like, if I look at that shape, that would mean in this shape an AI would live happily for the next 200 years or so?
Maybe let's go to those images. So AI is a tool for us. It's not that the AI is
Not a form of intelligence.
Yeah, but you know, I'm fascinated by that we have the possibility to not draw on one precedence. For instance, what we used to do in architecture, you know, when you build a building, like, I don't know, like a university building, you look at 2, 3, maybe 5 precedents that has already been built, you know. But what if you can hybridize and synthesize hundreds of buildings, and that are not probably classified already into certain types of typology. For instance, you know, let me give you that example of our residential or houses, what we build, our flats, our apartments. They are based on the standards of the pre-war period. So, and the ideal back then was the nuclear family. So you live there, you work there, and our cities are still structured that way. So today we know that the way we live and the way we work has radically changed since the last 100 years. So why do we still rely on those standards? Why do we build apartments that are for the nuclear family, but the majority of the persons, or it's just 11% of that makes the classical family, you know, mom, dad, and 2 kids. So what I do believe is that our habitations, I try to prevent the words apartment and office and all that kind of classification, needs to be reconsidered and needs to be more flexible. And also then, if we think about how we build, the materiality, or for whom we build, I think we have to really consider as well other beings as well. So what if where our food production is not happening somewhere else, but is happening where we live? How could be that put together more condensed? And then we have probably structures and volumes, like you see here, that need not to be measured on a human body, but could be for someone else. That's does it answer the question?
Yes, so
Okay.
thank you. But I see now that there are 2 approaches to architecture. The one is using AI as a tool, and the other one is that we need to approach architecture in a different way, like as you said, thinking in terms of other living beings, because using AI as a tool, isn't there this bias that it's not really generating I mean, ideally it's able to create every possible architecture, but in theory it's based on what it has learned, and it has learned the history of architecture with the existing buildings. So even if we want architecture to help us out in this particular case, it might be biased and it might be counterproductive, because it only has this biased historical knowledge of architecture.
I totally agree on that. So there will always be a bias. You cannot get rid of the bias because there is always a view from somewhere. And to think that AI helps to be objective, that is an illusion. But the more you are transparent on what your position is, I think the more it is traceable, or the bias is traceable. So I think that is one important point. And the next one is, I mean, I'm not a computer scientist. I'm not able to code any algorithm or AI algorithm and generative adversarial model. But what I can do is to manipulate the data set. And this is what we have done in that project. So this is what we have done quite a lot. We do a lot of research on the data set. How can we control what might be the result? So that was a very conscious act that we scale the existing architecture according to different proportions to really get way out of that traditional architecture. But of course, it could be extended in the way, okay, not only to involve human-made architecture, but also, okay, what other beings have made. And the process we develop would allow that, because we are able to hybridize and synthesize between different scales. So that is, of course, an aspect.
If you look at the models and the pictures you showed us, they're most unlike the mold, they're morphing. And I, to a certain extent, understand how that works with the mold. To a certain extent, it basically eats itself, I assume, and it's recreates itself. But I have a hard time wrapping my head around the process-oriented architecture. Like, how would this morphing? How can I imagine this morphing? It's like if I have to adjust for kids and adults and other objectives, how can I imagine that?
Oh, well, I mean, the slime mold we just applied to urban structures on a 2-dimension, because I think it's working there. I have doubts that it would work in 3 dimensions. But I mean, it was an experiment to really explore how we could introduce different sorts of thinking. And a slime mold is, I mean, there's done so much research, and the good thing is there is also a mathematic how you can really reproduce how its logic is working to a certain degree, and that's why it's that you can really easily adapt it. But I mean, we have done that project a couple of years ago, you're touching on a question that is a quite difficult one, because I think, I mean, having done that project and see how one natural system or biological system could be applied to an artificial was an interesting way, but it is also like the Tokyo experiment I've told you, is that you have to manipulate that slime mold very exactly to get what you want. And that has also to do, because I do not believe in that anymore, that we can take an isolated system like the slime mold and adapt it to easily to something else, because there are so many other ecologies and systems involved. So for us, it was more the experience that, okay, that one system is giving you one sort of information, but you have tons of others, and especially a city is not reducible to one system. So you have a lot of different influences and systems that work with each other, maybe counter to each other, maybe in parallel. So it's more about finding as we discussed before, the where do they intersect? And then how could you hack that? Probably. How could you change that? So it's more of having those very or many systems and different complexities interacting and are entangled to figure out where is that intersection. How could you probably then hack it, as I said before. Yeah.
No, also, so then the morphing, is the morphing idea used as we discussed before with the process, yeah? So there shouldn't be like a certain goal where you're gonna stop and then it's finished and then that's it. But there should be a process to like a life being basically of living, yeah? There are two questions I have here. Is it more that you use the process to then find a stage where you think it's going to be best adequatable to the system or to a process or to a place? Or is it more that that it's a living organism which actually changes with its inhabitants?
Well, honestly, we haven't thought about that in both that way. For us, it was really about, could we translate that logic into the AI and see what kind, into what degree does it change the urban structure, or what kind of other spatial organization would it create? So it was really more the experiment on to what degree is it possible to implement it, and is it useful? Does it lead to something, or how could we integrate another intelligence, so to say, or another way of thinking and organizing itself, so to say.
Okay, thanks a lot for this super fascinating talk, and I really like the projects you presented. And since you showed this one slide with the artificial creatures or non-human characters you used as a design prompt or character to design for, I'm wondering whether you see any other like not application areas, but any other areas outside of architecture that would benefit from a similar approach. Because from my perspective, I see this as a kind of a post-human design approach or strategy that, although I do not have a good example yet, but I think could work well in so many other areas. So have you also thought about design areas outside of architecture to benefit from something, from an approach like that, to get out of this usual like bounding boxes that we have and also AI has and so on?
Well, actually not. Honestly, have to say, but I can imagine that in any kind of product design, of course. But of course, it needs to be questioned to what degree is it feasible and also usable. Because I think it might not make sense to design a fork that is for a plant, but
one could argue about that.
Yeah, maybe. But maybe you guys have more answers on that question, as you coming from a different background. But I mean, we have in our lives there are a lot of standards and norms, and I think that there could be question indeed with the kind of tools. But of course, I think the focus is a different one. It's probably not the human body. It's probably, I don't know, something else. So questioning any kind of norm or standard that is from 100 years ago or even more, I think can be questioned. So and that is really also in that direction where I see change our conventional view about something. So really producing that friction that that we suddenly realize, oh, okay, why not looking at this from that perspective? Indeed, I think that is the most potential for me, at least. So as I'm especially not interested in reproducing what a human is able to do. So I see them more as a collaborator in trying to find new ideas.
Thanks.
Thank you. What you just said about the overcoming existing views or conventional views, I think in terms of city and architecture, there might be the two levels on which this could be applied. The one is on the housing and on the building level, but then also on the city scale, like how cities evolve and how cities grow. And they are maybe not so much related to measurements of height or so, but more to what we think as a society are meaningful regulations. Like, do we want shops in or industry? How close do we want industry to living areas, or do we want to have shops in living areas or not? And then everything is dependent on such a decision, like how broad do roads have to be built so that the car can deliver everything to this shop or so. So a lot of city appearance is based on housing or city regulations. And as you said, some of these we have a historical development here, but some of these are also not easy to overcome, because then the city might not work anymore if we want to change. Like there is this huge difference between European cities and US cities, and you cannot just go from one system to the other because nothing would fit anymore, or I don't know. But the AI would allow us to play or to investigate in different concepts, maybe.
Well, I mean, a city won't change that fast, so it changes anyhow, very, very slow. And architecture, I would say, is also a discipline that evolves very, very slow, due to that fact that it takes time to build something. But of course, you can start with the building scale, but also, I mean, deliveries, or as the example that you mentioned, that trucks have access and can deliver something. Maybe that is also changing. You know, what if? I have once a discussion with an expert on mobility, and they were telling me that it actually did try to distribute everything in the city a bit equally, and then I was wondering, what if a network is within the building so that you don't need even trucks? So what is, for instance, you know, to use those smaller volumes, why is not probably your parcel is coming in some kind of tubes in there, or then there are so many other models of, for instance, all the sharing economy. Also, I mean, it's not that popular here, but in the US is as an example they have the model of rent a runway, so where you can rent your clothes. So why not having a shared closet, and that is circulating within the building? So okay, maybe I'm going off now, but if that is changing, or if the city is changing, maybe a lot of different systems are changing, but maybe those systems have to change before the city is able to adapt. But I do think that the scale in the city that you mentioned needs to be radically rethought, because that is also, I mean, that comes from modernism as well. You know, I mean, that model was set up after, where people lived in those Mietskasernen, and where the industry is in the city, and everything was full of smog and everything was dirty, and that's where they decided, okay, we need a different urban model. So, and then they shifted the industry to the periphery, or suburbia. It's actually moving towards that, and that became possible through the car culture. And actually that is and that model is actually now producing all that problems we have, all the car that we have to take a long distance to get somewhere, to get something. So where we live, where we work, where we buy stuff. So David Harvey, for instance, a scholar in New York, once said in an interview with The Guardian, if you were not able to change the model of urbanization, you would never get a climate crisis so to say, in order, because there are so many things connected with it. And he, in particular, reference to suburbia, because I mean, and another scholar at the book once said, ironically, actually, in Austria in particular, 75% would love to have a house in the middle of the green. And she said, and it's polemically said that the other 25% already have one. But I mean, Austria, for instance, is European championship in sealing land. And if we continue that way, we do not have any agriculture land left in maybe less than 200 years. So then we have a real problem how to produce our food, the necessary food we need. And I mean, that the model of urbanization, it's not just that you're sealing the land where the house is on, but you have to build streets and so forth. So that goes on and on and on. Or I could extend on those examples. For instance, in Austria, the size of Eisenstadt are vacant buildings. So nothing is there. It's just it's empty buildings, because supermarkets or whatever just decided, oh, we need a little bit bigger one, and that is not adaptable. So we build a new one and leave that empty. So, yeah.
I mean, every process and every movement has a very strong time element, I assume. So how do you see the the time frames you're talking about? Like how dynamic are those things? Because like it's a lot of those things which a lot of the change you're talking about is probably generations.
Oh, absolutely. And I do think we have to think in those deep time frames, because currently we have a very short-term thinking also of buildings. And to be more sustainable, we have to think in much longer processes, I think. So even probably hundreds of years, not only decades. So of course that is a difficult thing. That is the most challenging, probably, because how to project so far into the future. But I think it's a necessary step to at least change a bit our way of thinking. Of course, it might not be the right one, because no one knows what might happen in 50 or 100 years. But to change the mindset, I think it's a necessary step to extend those time frames.
So, but you would propose, from my experience in my life, I've seen two approaches to this question. One is to have strong, big buildings, which lasts the quest of time, with all the positive and negative effects. And then you have the model I saw in America, where basically you assume that nobody wants to live in any building after 10 years. So you build them as cheap as possible, so you can rip them out, so you can just rebuild them as soon as possible. So from if I understand, it's more the first approach.
Well, no, I'm not approaching Roman monumentality. But you know, while thinking about those different time frames, I think that what we have to think is also the decay of a building, not just the building, but the decay. And if we think about the decay and involve it into the process, then we automatically have to think about different materialities, what is happening with them. So, for instance, when we put oil on the facade, it's not probably the solution to save energy, because it needs a lot of energy to produce those, and also it's then toxic waste. What do you do with it? And if you have to think about the decay, I think it might radically change the way we build. So if everyone who is constructing also needs to show how to demolish it, that might change a bit.
Thank you. Okay. Then I thank you very much for coming. Thanks for this great insights. And I wish
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It was a great pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you.